The year is 1876, and a wagon is pulling into Deadwood, South Dakota, a place that by every legal definition does not exist. The federal government never recognized it. There were no courts, no sheriff with any real authority, no legal framework of any kind. The land belonged to the Lakota Sioux by treaty, yet 30,000 miners flooded in anyway, driven by the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. And among those 30,000 men, there were women, thousands of them. Their presence in places like Deadwood, Virginia City, Tombstone, and Body raises one of the most fascinating and underexplored questions in American history, not simply how they arrived, but how they endured, how they built lives, how they wielded power in environments designed structurally and socially to erase them. The answer is far more complex, far more unsettling, and far more remarkable than the mythology Hollywood has sold us for a century. To understand what these women faced, you first have to understand what a mining boomtown actually was. These were not towns in any conventional sense. They were improvisational cities that erupted from the earth almost overnight, driven entirely by the promise of mineral wealth. Deadwood went from a handful of prospectors camped along a gulch to a settlement of thousands in a matter of months. The population was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly transient, and overwhelmingly operating outside the bounds of civilization as the 19th century understood it. Violence was not an aberration in these places. It was a structural feature. Men carried firearms as a matter of course. Disputes over claims were settled with guns. The infamous Deadwood resident Wild Bill Hickok was shot dead in a saloon in August of 1876, just weeks after arriving in town, and his killer walked free for months because there was no functional legal system to prosecute him. That was the world these women stepped into. The first question historians have wrestled with is deceptively simple. Who were these women? The popular imagination has flattened them into two archetypes: the schoolmarm in a bonnet and the saloon girl in a corset. Reality was immeasurably more textured. Women who made their way to the mining frontier came from staggering varieties of backgrounds, driven by equally varied motivations. Some were wives and daughters who followed husbands and fathers chasing gold. Some were entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in the raw, supply-starved economies of boomtowns. Laundresses, cooks, boarding house operators, seamstresses who charged prices that would have been absurd in established cities, but made perfect sense in places where a dozen eggs cost more than a day's wages back east. Some were women running from something: failed marriages, poverty, scandal, violence in their pasts. Some were immigrants navigating not only the chaos of the frontier, but the additional alienation of a foreign language and culture. Chinese women, Mexican women, Irish women, black women, all of them present in these towns, all of them occupying different and often overlapping social positions, all of them devising different strategies for survival. What strikes researchers most when they dig into the primary sources, the census records, the newspaper accounts, the letters and diaries that have survived, is how entrepreneurially agile these women were. The mining frontier was, in a perverse way, a space of economic possibility for women precisely because it was so undersupplied and so desperate. A woman who could cook a decent meal in a place where men had been eating beans out of a can for 6 months could charge extraordinary prices. Boarding houses run by women in towns like Virginia City became some of the most financially successful operations in their communities. Mary Ellen Pleasant, a black woman who had escaped slavery and reinvented herself multiple times before arriving in California during the gold rush, used her skills as a cook and her extraordinary social intelligence to accumulate capital that she later deployed in business ventures and, covertly, in funding abolitionist causes. She is one of the most remarkable figures of the entire era, and she is almost entirely absent from popular historical consciousness. But we should not romanticize this. Survival in mining towns was brutal work, and the line between agency and desperation was often invisible from the outside and sometimes invisible from the inside. The most common occupation listed for women in census records from mining towns is almost uniformly prostitute. Ndun. Historians estimate that in the early years of boom towns, the majority of women present were engaged in sex work in some capacity. This was not simply a matter of moral failure, as contemporaries and many later historians framed it. It was a response to an economic and social reality. These were women who, in many cases, had no other marketable skills that the specific economy of a mining town would reward, or who had been trafficked, coerced, or gradually maneuvered into the trade through poverty and circumstance. Chinese women in particular arrived in California and Nevada in large numbers after being promised respectable work, only to find themselves sold into brothels in what was, by any modern definition, human trafficking. Their situation was compounded by xenophobia, by the language barrier, by the Page Act of 1875, which specifically targeted Chinese women on the assumption that they were all prostitutes, a law that effectively institutionalized the very exploitation it claimed to address. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? Let us know your city and state, because this story touched every corner of America, and we want to know who is out there learning it with us. The economics of sex work in mining towns were themselves deeply stratified. At the top of the hierarchy, in the loosest possible sense of the word, were the parlor house madams, women who operated high-end establishments catering to wealthier miners and businessmen. Figures like Dora Dufran in Deadwood, Mattie Silks in Denver, and Julia Bulette in Virginia City built genuine economic empires within the constraints of their professions. Mattie Silks is a particularly striking example. She arrived in Denver in the 1870s, established a parlor house that became one of the most successful in the city, and over the course of her career accumulated enough capital to invest in real estate and retire in comfort. She was, by every measure except social respectability, a successful entrepreneur operating in an economy that offered her almost no other legal path to financial independence. Below this stratum came the women working in the line houses, then the women working in cribs, tiny, often unheated rooms, and finally the street workers who occupied the bottom of a hierarchy that was dangerous, impoverished, and brutally short in terms of life expectancy. The physical dangers these women faced were relentless. Disease was the great equalizer on the mining frontier. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and tuberculosis moved through boom towns with devastating efficiency, aided by overcrowding, contaminated water sources, and the near-total absence of sanitation infrastructure. Women were not more susceptible than men to these diseases, but their social position often meant they had less access to whatever rudimentary medical care existed, and for women in sex work, sexually transmitted infections were an additional and often fatal threat. Syphilis in the pre-antibiotic era was a death sentence delivered slowly, and it moved through mining communities with grim consistency. Violence was the second great threat. Women were assaulted, beaten, and killed in mining towns, and the consequences for their attackers were often negligible. The murder of a prostitute in Deadwood or Tombstone was unlikely to produce a serious investigation, much less a prosecution. Women learned out of necessity to protect themselves, and protect themselves they did, in ways that challenge every assumption about Victorian femininity. Many women in mining towns carried firearms. This was not remarkable in a cultural context where nearly everyone was armed, but it is worth pausing on the image of a woman in an 1870s dress with a pistol in her apron pocket, because it ruptures the conventional narrative so completely. Calamity Jane, Martha Jane Canary, is the most famous example. A woman who dressed as a man, worked as a scout, and navigated the frontier on terms that were almost entirely her own. But she was not the anomaly she is usually presented as. Census records from mining towns repeatedly list occupations for women that 19th century propriety would have considered male: haulers, miners themselves in a few documented cases, gamblers, saloon operators. The frontier created cracks in gender norms through which some women slipped entirely. The social networks that women built in these towns were perhaps their most important survival mechanism, and they are also the hardest to recover from the historical record because they operated largely outside the official documentation that historians rely on. Women warned each other about dangerous men. They pooled resources in periods of scarcity. They cared for each other's children in the frequent cases when a mother was incapacitated by illness or death. The boarding house, as a social institution, functioned as far more than a commercial enterprise. It was a node of community in places that were otherwise profoundly atomized. Women who ran boarding houses knew everyone, heard everything, and wielded a form of social intelligence that was a genuine form of power, even when it was unrecognized as such. We also have to talk about the women who arrived in these towns as wives, because their experience was distinct in important ways, and is often either sentimentalized beyond recognition or dismissed as peripheral. The reality of being a married woman on the mining frontier was one of extraordinary labor, physical hardship, and psychological stress. Women were expected to maintain the domestic sphere under conditions that made domesticity nearly impossible. In canvas tents, in rough-hewn cabins without floors, in buildings where the walls let in enough wind to extinguish candles in a stiff breeze. They cooked on open fires, hauled water, washed clothes by hand, gave birth without medical assistance, and buried children at rates that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard. Infant mortality on the frontier was staggering. Women who kept diaries from this period, and a surprising number did, described the loss of children with a matter-of-factness that reads as emotional suppression, but probably reflects something closer to exhaustion. There was no time to grieve when there were 3 surviving children to feed and a husband who had been underground for 14 hours. If you are finding this as compelling as we do, pause for a second and share this video with someone who loves history. The algorithm rewards engagement, and more importantly, this story deserves to be heard. Who do you know that would want to know about these women? The relationship between women and institutional religion in mining towns is another thread that reveals the complexity of frontier life. Churches arrived in boom towns fairly quickly. Missionaries and circuit preachers were not far behind the prospectors, and they became, almost immediately, sites of social negotiation between different visions of what the community should become. Women were central to this process. They organized Sunday schools, founded charitable societies, and pushed for the construction of permanent church buildings in places that might have remained entirely transient. This was not simply pious sentiment. It was a strategic effort to build the kind of stable social infrastructure that would make the town a place where families could live rather than merely where men came to extract wealth. Women understood, often more clearly than men, that the long-term habitability of these communities depended on institutions, and they worked to build them. At the same time, the relationship between the respectable churchwomen and the women in the brothels was not simply one of condemnation. The historical record contains numerous examples of complexity and even solidarity that cut across the moral categories of the era. Nurses and charitable workers who operated under church auspices regularly provided care to sick and dying prostitutes. Madams sometimes funded community institutions. Dora Dufran in Deadwood is documented as having contributed to community projects while simultaneously operating one of the town's most prominent brothels. These relationships were uncomfortable for everyone involved, and they are rarely discussed in popular histories, but they are essential for understanding how these communities actually functioned. The question of race adds yet another dimension of complexity that the mythology of the Old West has systematically obscured. Black women on the mining frontier occupied a position of triple marginalization by gender, by race, and often by economic status. Yet the historical record contains remarkable figures who navigated these constraints with extraordinary resourcefulness. Biddy Mason arrived in California as an enslaved woman brought by her enslaver from Mississippi. She filed for and won her freedom in 1856, and over the following decades became one of the wealthiest property owners in Los Angeles, accumulating real estate holdings worth what would be millions in contemporary terms. She founded the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. She was a practicing midwife who delivered an estimated 3,000 babies. She is, by almost any measure, one of the most significant figures in 19th century California history, and she is almost entirely absent from popular accounts of the gold rush era. The experiences of native women in and around mining towns constitute a category of tragedy that sits somewhat outside the frame of survival in the sense we have been discussing, because for many native communities, the arrival of mining operations was not merely a disruption, but an existential catastrophe. The Black Hills, where Deadwood sits, were sacred Lakota territory explicitly protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The discovery of gold there and the subsequent flood of miners represented a direct violation of that treaty, one that the federal government initially pretended to resist and then effectively endorsed by failing to stop the invasion and eventually forcing new treaty negotiations. Lakota women and women of other nations experienced the mining era as invasion, violence against their communities, displacement from their lands, the destruction of the ecological systems on which their ways of life depended. This is not a parallel story to the one about the women who came to the mining towns. It is the foundation on which that story sits, and it cannot be separated from it. The legal status of women in mining towns deserves careful attention because it shaped the practical realities of their lives in ways that are easy to underestimate. Married women in 19th century America operated under coverture, the legal doctrine that merged a woman's legal identity with that of her husband upon marriage. This meant that a married woman could not own property in her own name in most states, could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued independently. She could not, in a meaningful legal sense, protect herself through the courts even when courts existed. The mining frontier, paradoxically, offered some married women more de facto autonomy than they would have had in established cities, simply because the informal and often extra-legal character of frontier communities meant that these rules were applied inconsistently. But it also meant that a woman whose husband died or abandoned her, both common occurrences in the dangerous and transient world of the mining frontier, could find herself legally and economically stranded in a way that had no simple remedy. We are at the heart of this story now, and we want to know, are you watching this all the way through? What part of this history surprised you the most? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one, and your engagement genuinely helps us keep making content like this. Widowhood was, in fact, one of the more common and better documented paths to female economic independence on the frontier. When a miner died, and miners died constantly, from cave-ins, from flooding, from explosions, from the accumulated physical damage of underground work, from violence, from disease, his widow was sometimes left with the claim itself, which in favorable circumstances represented real wealth. Women who had the practical knowledge and the physical capability to work the claim, or the business acumen to hire workers and manage the operation, sometimes converted widowhood into independence. This was not typical. Most widows faced immediate economic crisis. But the cases where it worked out represent some of the more interesting stories of frontier female entrepreneurship, precisely because they emerged from the most extreme circumstances. The press played an interesting and often contradictory role in shaping the narrative around women in mining towns. Frontier newspapers were plentiful. In many boom towns, a newspaper was among the first permanent institutions established, and they wrote about women constantly, but within a framework that served particular ideological functions. Women who conformed to domestic virtue were celebrated, women who defied convention were sensationalized, and women who existed in between, the vast majority, were either ignored or crammed into one of the available narrative slots. The coverage of Calamity Jane in the Deadwood press is a case study in this dynamic. She was alternately lionized as a frontier eccentric, mocked as a figure of carnival grotesquerie, and occasionally genuinely admired, but always in ways that contained her within a story that the newspaper's readership could process. The actual complexity of her life, the alcoholism, the itinerant poverty, the genuine skills as a marksman and teamster, the possibly fabricated relationship with Wild Bill Hickok, was reduced to a marketable mythology that persists to this day. The mythology is worth dwelling on because it has done real damage to our understanding of the historical reality. The Western genre, in its various iterations across novels, films, and television, has produced an image of the frontier woman that is almost invariably a supporting character in a man's story. She is the school teacher who civilizes the rough cowboy, the saloon girl with the heart of gold who dies so the hero can have motivation, the steadfast wife waiting at home while the men do the interesting work. This is not an innocent mythology. It reflects and reinforces a cultural preference for stories that center male agency and relegate female experience to the margins. When we go back to the primary sources, the census records, the business licenses, the court documents, the diaries, the letters, what we find is not a supporting cast. We find protagonists operating in conditions of extreme difficulty with intelligence, adaptability, and will that the mythology cannot accommodate. Consider the case of Ah Toy, a Chinese woman who arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush and became one of the most complicated and fascinating figures of the entire era. She came to California initially as an indentured servant, which in practice meant a form of debt bondage that operated very close to outright slavery. She found a way out of that situation through relationships with wealthy white men, and eventually established herself as a brothel operator in San Francisco. What makes her story historically remarkable is what she did next. She repeatedly used the legal system, specifically the courts of San Francisco, to protect her business interests. She sued men who owed her money. She filed complaints against those who attempted to extort her. She appeared in court herself at a time when Chinese women were assumed to have no standing in legal proceedings, and she forced the courts to engage with her claims. She did not always win. The legal system was stacked against her in multiple directions simultaneously, but the fact that she tried, repeatedly, using the tools of a legal system that was not designed for her, represents a form of resistance that is profound and poorly understood. The medical landscape of mining towns reveals another dimension of women's experience that is easy to overlook. Formal medical care on the frontier was minimal, expensive, and often more dangerous than the conditions it purported to treat. Frontier surgeons operated without anesthesia in many cases, without sterile technique in virtually all cases, and with a level of anatomical knowledge that was, by modern standards, primitive. Into this gap stepped women who possessed traditional knowledge of herbal remedies, midwifery, and nursing care, knowledge that had been passed down through female networks for generations, and that the male medical establishment alternately scorned and quietly depended upon. Women who practiced as midwives on the mining frontier delivered a staggering proportion of the children born in these communities. They also cared for the sick and dying in ways that went far beyond childbirth, nursing accident victims, managing chronic illness, providing the continuous bedside care that physicians who moved between patients and often between towns could not provide. The subject of children in mining towns is one that deserves sustained attention because it illuminates both the precariousness and the resilience of these communities. Children were present from the earliest stages of settlement. Miners brought families, women arrived pregnant, babies were born in conditions that would horrify any contemporary observer. Child mortality was catastrophic by modern standards. Infections that are trivially treatable today killed children routinely. Accidents were common in environments that had no concept of child safety. Children worked alongside adults in many cases, hauling water, tending animals, contributing to the domestic labor that kept households functioning. And yet communities also built schools, sometimes before they built anything else that might suggest permanence. Women were central to this educational effort, both as teachers and as the organizers who pushed for schools to be built and funded. The schoolteacher archetype, while reductive, contains a genuine historical truth. Women fought for educational institutions in mining towns because they understood that education was infrastructure, that it was what made a transient camp into a town, and a town into something that might last. Right now, we want to know something simple. Hit the like button if you have learned something in this video that genuinely surprised you. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that we are hitting the mark with the research and storytelling. Now, back to the story. The long-term demographic trajectory of mining towns is itself a fascinating lens through which to view women's role in frontier history. Towns that survived the initial boom and bust cycle almost universally followed a pattern. The proportion of women in the population increased steadily as the initial frenzy gave way to more stable industrial mining operations, and as the population of women increased, so did the density of social institutions. Schools, churches, civic organizations, libraries, hospitals. These things followed women into mining communities. This is not coincidental. It reflects the way in which women carried social infrastructure as a kind of cultural practice, building the connective tissue of community in places where the dominant economic logic was purely extractive. The towns that failed to retain women, that remained overwhelmingly male and transient, tended to collapse entirely when the ore played out. The towns that developed a stable female population and the domestic, educational, and civic institutions that came with it sometimes survived and occasionally became cities. Deadwood itself is an instructive case. In its earliest years, it was a place of almost pure chaos, violent, filthy, overcrowded, and operating entirely outside legal structures. By the 1880s, a decade after the initial gold rush, it had a school, several churches, a hospital, a library society, and a functioning, if imperfect, legal system.